Hello and welcome back to Magic in the Noise. Today we want to talk about a mistake and a solution to that mistake that a lot of remote viewers are making through no fault of their own. If remote viewers really understood the solution to this, it would really unlock their remote viewing potential.
We will touch upon different current remote viewing methodologies. Although it may sound like we're positive and negative for different methodologies, I want you to understand if a methodology works for you, it's totally fine. I'm not trying to offend anybody, but at the same time, if we do not talk about this information, for some of those people, this information could actually improve their capabilities, and without it, they won't.
Mind to Mind by Warcollier is one of the first books referenced on Irva's remote viewing timeline. The book covers telepathic experiments over a 40-year period, so starting back in the 1920s, that really focused on transmitting visual information between a sender and a receiver.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this, when we looked into it, there's all sorts of references. The CIA, the SRI, Ingo Swann, all of them have referenced this material. This is something that they studied as one of their foundational books in terms of trying to understand how to remote view. Because before remote viewing, what was there? There was Warcollier and his attempts to understand how telepathy might work and what that would look like, which is covered in this book, which I suggest everybody get. To be honest, is quite interesting.
We really feel that a lot of this material that Warcollier discovered through his experiments really should have been integrated into the CRV protocol to improve its effectiveness, the richness of the data, the accuracy, and just the sheer volume of data. It's surprising to see that work being done in the 20s and then CRV being developed, and they're referencing Warcollier, but they're not integrating that information into it.
This is one of the key things I found to be honestly disturbing. We could easily speculate as to why this might have occurred, but logically, it does not make any sense to me. Warcollier is showing transmission of visuals that are coming through and being recorded between a sender and a receiver. What's fascinating about that is that you can see that CRV's interpretation of this was to take a derivative of this effort and to make it into an ideogram. And for me, you can have the picture or you can have a squiggle. Do you want the picture or do you want the squiggle? So this is where I start to have a problem. And as we started to kind of dissect this information, it made less and less sense as to why CRV does not include visuals.
As much as other forms, or as much as we think that they should, or as much as is possible. And one of the things I think is important to note, even when you look back at Warcollier's work, he's talking about fairly untrained people who are getting these fantastical visual results. As trained remote viewers, we know we can do so much more, and our sessions are a lot more powerful than they were when we started. And so even if you look at Warcollier's work where he had fragments, corner edges of a square, for example, if the target was a square. So you can see how maybe from that, the ideogram develops as if you see a peak, then it's a mountain or it's a natural structure. But that would only apply to, again, to beginners, to people with no remote viewing experience. As you move forward in your development, then you should recognize that you can let that go and move into something more sophisticated imagery.
Yeah, when I started remote viewing, it was with Ed Dame's TRV, and then he spent all this training on breaking down the squiggle into parts, like, oh, if you make an angle, that's a structure or a mountain, and make wavy line, it's water or sand, things of that nature. There's zero training to go and actually look for a visual. In fact, Ed always said, don't ever close your eyes, you'll invite imagination, right? This is the ideogram. The ideogram you can see in Warcollier's work as these, essentially there's different processes for how the information is transported across and received by the viewer in these telepathy experiments. And in some cases, they are very much like the actual drawing, the original drawing. And in other cases, like Sasha said, they're fragments. And when you see those fragments, and we have proof in the CIA documents, they basically just took that process where in some cases you get parts separated instead of combined like they should and put them down, and they see them more as gestalts. We'll show you side-by-side examples of similarities between mind to mind and what the CIA document said, which is associated with the ideogram.
In the book Mind to Mind by Warcollier, he describes the direct acquisition of visual imagery to produce accurate remote viewing results or telepathic results. And we do see this in some forms, some methodologies of remote viewing, namely HRVG, where you have visual ideograms as your first target contact when you start your sessions. And that maps on to what Warcollier was describing, which is you don't need to do a lot of stages and steps. You can go right into direct perception of visual data.
This is a good point, Sasha. And in HRVG, I've done it, you've done it, and other people that I know have done it on the first visual, gotten information that's very complex that explains key elements associated with the target. Whereas with an ideogram, I'm sorry, you're not going to get that information. And I don't want to spend 12 pages to do a movement order to look for a visual in CRV or TRV or anything else. It just seems completely inefficient.
I think that that's a really good key, which is what Warcollier is showing is that you can, right out of the gate, acquire the visual data about the target. And in HRVG protocol, the first thing you do is attempt to look at the target and acquire visual data about the target. Whereas in other methods, the use of the ideogram is an intermediary. It's between you and the visual perception. So now instead of just going and trying to see what's there and starting a little sketch, you're doing an ideogram that you then have to spend time decoding in order to get data that would be covered by the sketch.
Yeah, and this is a key point that we're trying to make here is that a layman could look at an ideogram, they would have no clue what that means, but they could look at your drawing, your visual representation of the target on page 1, and they could clearly see what you were trying to communicate. A ideogram is a derivative. It's a subset of the information, and this is part of why I think it may be a problem. I think it may have actually not been in the public protocols, because if you think about it, if it's easier for people to actually just get high, accurate, complex target information through a visual on page 1 with all these protocols. Sasha, do you think that that's a problem for intelligence agencies? Would they maybe think that maybe they want to like pull back and make it a little harder?
Definitely.
Or do you think there's some other reason? I mean, it just seems really strange to me.
Yes, definitely. You don't need to have that sigil in order to be able to have all the data about the target there on your page. You can do it through sketches. And also, the data is in you. It's not in the sigil that you're probing. It's not in the ideogram. It's within you.
The other point here to make is that, some people might say like, oh, well, they didn't include this because not everybody can do it. Well, I guarantee you that they could have included it as an option and talked about it, and they didn't. That speaks volumes to me as to their intent on this. Either somebody made a horrible mistake, in my opinion, or this is intentional. That's speculation. You can speculate on that. But the point is that I want to make with Sasha, because she can articulate something that is interesting, is that Sasha has aphantasia, if I said that correctly, and she's still able to get visuals, even though it's something that's difficult for her to do. So this is a very key point. If it wasn't included because, oh gosh, people can't get it, it's so hard to get visuals, and you have somebody who actually has an issue with normally getting visuals, Sasha, have you been able to successfully get visual information in some form that you're able to transcribe that actually is like a picture is worth 1,000 words and actually describes far greater than an ideogram would ever describe in that situation? Yes or no?
Definitely, yeah. And even though I do have aphantasia, so most of the time, the vast majority of the time, I'm getting conceptual image data, not actually seeing the image data. But when I combine that with a little bit of automatic writing, the imagery that I'm drawing is accurate. And I've done it in ways that have been startling to me.
Yeah, and I've done that too in terms of the automatic part. So sometimes I can see, and it's a whole nother level of training or discussion that I'm very wanting at some point to kind of discuss my own personal opinions on this and experiences. But I have sometimes seen shadowy imagery and I'll do the best, but I'm also sort of feeling where it's correct. And when I've done that, we've seen where I'll get, and I'm not going to mention the person's name, but it's a professional viewer, where we were working the same target and I got the same hieroglyphics as the other viewer. And people were shocked by it. I think this comes into play as well as in the case of our lightning video, which you can see. Sasha, the analyst, saw something nobody else saw. What did you see, Sasha?
I saw the exact same path of the lightning going through your work and Chris's work,
which are both visual pull data that we transcribed. And it was a match to the actual lightning path.
It was a match to the image. The image that was the feedback image, it was an exact match. That was incredible to see. There's an element of automatic writing in there. At least, the other viewer, Chris, he just drew the lightning and it matched. It matched your angles and it matched the image's angles. It's an interesting combination. So I think even if Warcollier just happened to accidentally stumble upon people who were more visually gifted, and the CRV developers, they were working with people who had aphantasia, that shouldn't matter, because Warcollier's approach that I'm doing, because I've been trained in HRVG, which is direct perception of imagery and immediately drawing what I'm seeing at the target, however I'm seeing, whether it's conceptually or not. It works. It works for people who are not visually gifted. And so that, I don't think that's it might be a convenient excuse, but it's not an explanation for why CRV went down that route of translating everything to these ideograms instead of continuing that tradition that Warcollier had started.
There's an HRVA conference in 2002 where he talks about an experiment he was doing in a lab in the 70s. And yes, they experimented with out of body and all this kind of stuff. So you say, oh, he was doing out of body. I don't personally really care if that's the case or not, because if you look at him communicating this information, it was almost like he was sort of, in his mind, I could almost feel like he was just like, yeah, sure, I'm going to float up there and see it. Like he already knew he was doing it in a different manner. But he shows in that conference, you can see drawings that are very accurate for the target, and he didn't do CRV. He just went and looked, got the information, and transcribed it, which is the same thing that's happening in mind to mind, which is the same thing that HRV teaches you the protocols on how to do that, and it works. I was a terrible, terrible, terrible CRV, TRV remote viewer. I spent 300 targets. I was really trying to understand, like, does this really work? Is whatever. It's like, yeah, after 300 targets, I'm like, sure, it works, but I cannot solve any problem with it. I would have to be in a group of people to solve this, right? HRVG, there's power in visuals.
So here we're going to show you examples of some of our work where we feel that the first visual contact with the target brought back really powerful data that either summarized the target or were crucial elements of the target to show that this works. And these were done through HRVG. And then the remote viewing method that I have been developing, that I'm looking forward to starting to teach this summer, capitalizes on that and uses that important finding that you can, from your first target contact, get significantly good data. David, in your Wim Hof session, you had a perfect example of this. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so this is the very first page. This is a visual image. This is what I want people to understand, the power of this. It didn't require 20 pages of data to get to this point. It was the first page. And I show an open mouth, and I have the idea of like a dentist was like, say, ah. I didn't write that part. That essentially is the conceptually. An open mouth is associated with the concept of breathing. A closed mouth, you wouldn't know, right? But an open mouth, you have the inference of breathing, right? The target was Wim Hof, and the person just simply wanted to know, how is this person doing these kinds of mental things that this person is able to achieve? And Wim Hof states it's a breathing exercise. It's as simple as basically controlling your breath. That is technically, that information is all encapsulated in that singular image. Now, I would challenge any person in CRV, any variation of CRV, to create an ideogram that a layman could look at on the first page and say like, oh, okay, I get what this is, right? Now, Sasha, you had, for example, in your Hobbit session, you had gotten several images that had very high levels of complex data associated with them. Could you walk through that?
My first target contacts, my first 3 pages of my visits, included the pyramid and a reference to megalithic structures and changing of the zodiac and the Ice Age catastrophe. And that is a perfect summary of the target. I just want to say here, what this is proving, we're finding validation in Warcollier's work. Yeah. That you don't need to do 12 pages to open your aperture. You don't need to do 4 stages to get into theta brainwave state. You don't have to do all of that. Warcollier showed it, and we're finding it in our data. You can get target contact, first page, and you can get conceptual data. You can get complex data that's accurate and that solves the problem that the tasker has set forth. Another example of this would be, David, in your session on the missing crown jewels of Ireland.
Yeah, that was interesting because the very first page of the session, I drew a kingly, knightly sort of figure, and it has sort of the impression of a crown. The target was crown jewels. In my opinion, this is conceptual information that's combined together in imagery that sort of covers that crown usually has jewels by inference. There's a royalty associated with it. All that was accurate for the target, right? Later, when I took that image and decided, okay, let's now take a look at this a second time. I drew element, which to me was shocking at the time. Even both of them were shocking to me. Is the secondary one I'm drawing? I see what looks sort of something like a breastplate, and this guy who is a key figure within this target. He has an image of him with this braided sort of gold vest, which I saw as a gold breastplate, but also I saw the red cross with the, I think it was the white circle, and that's in the image that's on Wikipedia as well. So like you can compare, what I'm trying to say is like, you can take that visual image that I saw, and is it, photographically accurate? No, but you can look at that. You can take the Wikipedia page up for that's associated with this person who's with the target. A layman, not a remote viewer, a layman could look at that and say, oh yeah, I see that there's a similarity between these two, right? You're not going to get that with an ideogram, and I didn't necessarily need to go through all these complex steps to get to that point. That's the key point of this. And another example of this for you, Sasha, was some of the data that came through visually for the Black Knight.
Yes. Okay, so in my Black Knight, my first target contact was a triangular shape and an orbital motion pattern. That's the Black Knight moving above us. And so I thought that was really interesting that for me, I think that was the first time that it really struck me how powerful the data that can come through in your visits. And to see Warcollier getting the same kind of conclusions from his experiments with untrained people, it should encourage everyone to start trying their hand at it. If you've been doing CRV for 6 years, maybe just see, do you have to go through all those stages to get to the point where you can draw the target out? Or do you have that ability to, on your first page, make that kind of a connection? David, what I find with your sessions, it helps that you're such a great artist. It's not a necessary condition for being able to do this, clearly.
Right.
But I think in the session that you did in the Nautilus, where you were describing the squid, that was spectacular. And so definitely we're going to be showing the images here. Can you say a few things about that?
Yeah, but first, exactly what Sasha just said. Even though I'm an artist, I can leverage this ability better than somebody who's a non-artist. It's just a skill. You're combining two skills together, right? But Sasha doesn't necessarily have the same level of skill with drawing that I have, but you can clearly see the value that comes through in her work. It doesn't stop that from being useful. But yes, in the target for this was the movie 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I'll show up several images. One of them in particular is really interesting to me, but there's several others along with the descriptive information that came through. So a lot of these for me, I don't just see the visual. Once I see the visual and I start to transcribe it, I get a flood of information which is relevant, very relevant to the target. I don't need to do all these other protocols to pull that extra data. It's just there, like sentences worth, right? But in the movie, one of the components was this giant squid, right, that attacks the Nautilus in the movie. And I saw one of the elements, I saw the tentacle's mouth visually. It looked like a worm or something that was worm-like, and I just transcribed what I saw. But this is a movie monster, right? It's not real. I wouldn't be surprised if the way that thing was constructed, the mouth, which probably had to be like a tube to stick, because that monster's like pulling stuff in its mouth, probably had to have a cavity. So it's like, that was probably, if you pull it apart, I'm going to guess that actually may be a subcomponent inside the shell of the squid. But nonetheless, the mouth, I saw the teeth, right? And you can see very clearly, again, a layman can look at this and can clearly see, is this related to the squid in the movie, or yes or no? And I'm going to say, most people are going to say, of course. But if I was to just do an idiogram and then try to describe all this stuff, would it come out in a way that actually a layman could look at and clearly, without any training, go like, oh yeah, that's what that is?
One of the things I'd like to add here is I've seen this rising in popularity, this method of making sketches with dashed lines. And then I look at your squid imagery, and I'm very much encouraging people to let go of the dashed line sketching, because I think I'm sure at some point there was some use to that, and I think for automatic drawing, people incorporate that because they think it maybe gives them, I don't know, a better edge. But it's not necessary for automatic drawing. You don't have to do little sketched lines. You can actually just draw the line, and I actually think you get better automatic writing data coming through when you do the full line instead of sketch or line. because the whole motion can be more directed by subconscious processes that are trying to get the information through. And also just to communicate complex visual data, when you have all these little dashed lines, it becomes hard to see. Is this a person? Is it a mushroom? Unclear. Whereas when you're drawing and you're drawing the person or you're drawing the mushroom, then all that rich data is there. And it also allows for the system to move your body, to move your hand in ways, add little details that are otherwise missed and can be really accurate.
Yeah, and this is a conversation we had with Naeem, which you should look at the interview if you haven't seen it. It's pretty awesome. We're talking about drawings, and one of the things I said, in my opinion, what he stated was similar to what I was saying. But you can judge for yourself. Go look at the interview. But my experience, direct experience with this, is like when I see the visual and I transcribe it, I'm not doing dashed lines. I'm actually trying to replicate as closely as I can, which means I'm using all the skill. I'm using 3D imagery. I'm using sometimes it's a symbol. If it's a symbol, that's fine. I'm not going to dash line it. I'm going to draw you the actual symbol. But if I see something that's a high level of quality visual, that's a 2D, 3D visual, I'm going to try to transcribe that. The ones that are more complex, what I find every single time is the more I start to work on getting that image more accurate, because it could take several minutes. It's not necessarily, I'm just going to crack this out in 30 seconds. I actually get more and more data starts to come through without me actually trying. This conceptual, it's valid. It's valid information. So this is like you're on target now, and the drawing itself is allowing you to stay focused, because I'm not imagining what this thing is. I don't care about any of that stuff. All I'm trying to do is like, am I getting a accurate representation in my mind? Oh, it's not quite right there. Let me erase that, adjust that. And as I'm doing that, it's just immediately feeding me, because I'm in a state where I'm not analytical, other than from a part of transcription. So then I just start to immediately get like, oh, this feels like, oh, I gotta write that down, right? I gotta write this stuff down. It's very powerful, really powerful, guys. The other thing that I wanted to say about this is important. We're not saying that we're special. What we're saying is anybody can do this. This is what's really, really important. There's nothing special about me, and all you need to do is to have the right knowledge and engage in that process. And in my opinion, will pull more data of higher quality. And this is part of why we are putting this video out, is to try to help people. Because in my opinion, I cannot believe that the public version, because HRVG is under NDA, okay? So I don't consider it to be public. But the protocols that are public, they do not emphasize visuals like this.
All of you guys are 30 years behind the power curve. If you stick to CRV, CRV cannot solve the problem. It's a training tool, and it's great for that. A training tool so you can get the experience of remote viewing. Wow, this is real. Yep, it'll change your life forever, but it can't solve problems.
What we're saying here today is supported by Warcollier's research. And it's not just this one individual who happened to do research that kind of resonates with us. He worked with other people. There were others who did research citing his work. So there's this whole avenue of research that shows this, that's been largely forgotten or overlooked. We just thought we'd take out some of the key findings that were more interesting to us maybe, or resonated more with our approaches, and just talk about them, because we haven't seen much about that in the public sphere.